My first question is this. When you have the Russians taking over 3 Ukrainian warships, as they did today, having taken over a few of their bases yesterday, they're really getting away with everything they want to do. And whatever sanctions are being discussed or imposed doesn't seem to make a blind bit of difference.
Well, we shouldn't be comparing oranges and apples here. The truth is that we have taken some sanctions already. We have some travel bans, and now we're discussing some more sanctions. But the problem with sanctions is that they spiral out of control. So if we put a sanction on the Russians, they'll somehow retaliate. And suddenly we get into a system of sanctions which is very difficult to get out of. So we are pretty much in a lose-lose situation, and the instruments that we have on the European side are rather limited.
Are you implying that sanctions are a bad idea?
No, I'm not implying that they're a bad idea, but they have to be targeted quite well. Now, for instance, Prime Minister Cameron has been talking about an arms embargo. I think that's quite a good idea. But I think also we need to look at what other action we can do. And I'd say 2 things. Number one, we need to sign the association agreement with the Ukrainians. And that is a big thing, because remember, that's how this whole thing started. Now, the second thing we need to do is to put down an EU mission, an open EU mission in Ukraine. I think that's the type of instruments that we can use. But targeted sanctions, I'm not convinced they're going to work.
So you've got the Americans today announcing very targeted sanctions against specific individuals who are actually, a lot of them, members of the inner circle of Vladimir Putin in Moscow. And the Europeans so far have not done the same. Now, does that send a mixed message to Moscow? Does that weaken the message?
No, I don't think so, because to be quite honest, the differences between the personalities that are not allowed to travel either in the US or in Europe is very small. It sends a certain message, but it's not a very diversified message. And I don't also like the talk of the US sanctions being somehow tougher than the European sanctions. I think they're pretty much on the same level. The big difference between the US and the EU is that we have 320 billion euros worth of trade with the Russians, and the Americans have only 80 billion.
And the Russians, as far as you're concerned, stand to lose more if one went to the next level of sanctions than the Europeans?
Well, it's pretty much tit for tat. I would argue that the Russians are more dependent on Europeans than Europeans are on Russians. Then, of course, there's always the energy issue. Some European countries are, I think, exorbitantly dependent on Russian energy, and I'd like to see a little bit more diversity in their energy cake. What we did in Finland was to, yes, have Russian energy, but we also have our own stuff, so we're not dependent directly.
Now, yesterday I spoke to the Bulgarian president, who sounded quite alarmist and said that Crimea was the first step and then there will be others. Do you take the same alarmist view of Russia's intentions in the neighborhood?
Well, I don't want to do that. I mean, and the reason is twofold. One, I was very involved in the war in Georgia in 2008. Finland held the presidency of the OSCE. I was a foreign minister, and we brokered the peace. And, you know, to start giving inflammatory remarks at this stage about what Putin or what Russia is going to do, I don't think it's going to facilitate the situation. And the second reason is, of course, we have 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia. So we want to find a peaceful solution to this conflict.